So I've learned lots from reading Planting It, as I've learned from reading, say, William Lane Craig on Kalam Cosmological argument. I'd never say they were trash. I always say you'll learn a lot, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's going to help you really make much progress on the God question. Right, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I was just reading through some of the questions that people submitted as we were preparing for this, and I'm very impressed by the quality of the questions. They're very good. I suspect we won't get through all of them today, but they're great. Anyway, now, as some of you have picked up, I see from the questions, I spent 12 years as a Catholic priest, so studied theology, firstly here in New Zealand, and then I was sent off to Rome to study at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, or what I sometimes call the Pope's Bible School in Rome. So my graduate training in theology was not so much in theology, but in the historical study of the Bible, so historical and literary analysis of biblical texts. And that was interesting in itself, because the historical study of the Bible wasn't in itself a theological discipline. It didn't assume any truth about God. It simply said, look, we take these biblical texts as ancient texts, and we try and understand what they would have meant at the time they were written, and we try and understand the history of their interpretation, the way we might understand, the texts of Homer or the works of Cicero or whoever. So that was really good training in close reading of texts and in the historical analysis of texts. Then I came back here to New Zealand and worked as a priest for a couple of years, and then taught biblical studies for a time at the University of Otago, where I'm still teaching, within the Faculty of Theology. And then gradually moved, as I moved away from the priesthood and from the church, I moved into religious studies, into what the Germans wonderfully call Religionswissenschaft, the science of religion. And then eventually I found that every course I taught was turning into a philosophy course, even though it wasn't supposed to be. So I thought maybe I should legitimate this trend by doing another PhD in philosophy, which I did quite late in proceedings. And that, of course, became the book Theism and Explanation, which I think some of you may have read. And then in due course, I shifted from religious studies into philosophy, although I still teach in both programs. My primary home is the philosophy program, but I still teach courses in the religion program. And with excellent colleagues who study Buddhism, who do quite a lot on the cognitive science of religion, for example, who study Hinduism and other religious traditions. So I think that's also influenced me in my work in philosophy of religion. So that's a very quick overview of my background.
And recent work you've been doing?
Yeah, well, recent work, I did the book on Theism and Explanation. I've been very interested in the question of the naturalism of the sciences. Now, on the face of it, the modern sciences, I used to say, I now think actually science from its very inception, would not make any reference to the work of the gods or to the work of God. Science dealt in principle only with what we might call natural causes. Now, one of the motivations behind the book Theism and Explanation was to say, well, why is this? Why, if we had a really good explanation of something which appealed to God, wouldn't that become part of our best science? As it happens, we don't. But, if would it not be possible? And if scientists are, in principle, excluding theistic explanations from science, is this not merely a kind of atheist prejudice, a materialist a materialist prejudice that won't allow God a foot in the door. So that was the question that motivated the Theism and Explanation book. But of course, it led me also into a historical study of the origins of science, which became very interesting, and then into a historical study of science and religion relations. And that in turn led to the book on Galileo and the conflict between religion and science. When there are conflicts between religion and science, what lies behind these? Why do they occur? Then I realized that fine, all this stuff is about religion and science, but it's really about the Christian religion and modern science. So what about broadening the scope of the discussion? And so I was very keen to broaden the scope of this discussion. And the first outcome of that was the little Palgrave pivot book, Religion, Philosophy and Knowledge, which suggested a way in which you could discuss more questions in the philosophy of religion than does the Christian God exist. Interesting, sure, but there are more questions you can ask about religion as a philosopher. And then most recently, it's in press at the moment, a very short piece in the Cambridge Elements series, a short book entitled Deprovincializing Science and Religion, in which I've tried to say, okay, I've written about the relation between the Christian faith and modern science in the Galileo book. What about other cultures, which may not even have the categories of science and religion? How do these two ways of thinking about the world relate in those other cultures? And so that's my attempt to kind of broaden the scope of the religion and science discussion as well.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we can begin with the questions. So I will, the same people have asked multiple questions. So to be fair, I will pick one from each, and then I will repeat the round. We will go for about 60 minutes, and then we'll end the AMA. Does that sound good?
That sounds good, yep.
Okay, so I'm going to start with Big Dog's question. It's a personal question, but it's an interesting one. It says, what are your thoughts on Pascal's wager? Did the idea of hell ever bother you after your deconversion, as it does many recent ex-Christians?
Oh, no, that's an excellent question. The short answer to the second part of the question is no, it didn't. I think in the end, I got to the point where, firstly, even in the days when I was a reasonably devout practicing Catholic, I never thought that God would condemn you to hell for not believing in God. In fact, I think if I recall correctly, the Second Vatican Council back in 1965, the big council of Catholic bishops that reformed the church, actually says that a person who doesn't believe in God, but who nonetheless is seeking the truth to the best of his or her ability, I think the wording is something like, God would surely not withhold his grace from such a person. So the idea that Pascal clearly still believed in, that God would condemn you to hell for not believing in him, was never an idea I found very plausible, even when I was a devout Catholic. So I guess I was lucky to be brought up in a family where we were devout Catholics, but it was a very kind of liberal, intellectual kind of Catholicism where lots of Christians were asked. So I guess from that point of view, Pascal's wager didn't bother me very much. I think Pascal's wager is a very interesting piece of argument, and I do think Richard Swinburne's kind of revival of the Pascal wager type argument in Faith and Reason is interesting. And of course, John Bishop here in New Zealand and Auckland has got a book, Believing by Faith, which is a kind of a William James version of a related argument. So philosophically, Pascal's wager is interesting, but I wouldn't say I'm bothered by the possible threat of hell. I'll be surprised if it turns out there is a God, but there might be reasons he sends me to hell, but I don't think it will be for not believing in him.
All right. Yeah, that's a good answer. Just quickly, the questions that I'm picking out are also questions that are such that they're not like explicitly answered by Professor Dawes in his book. And so I'm going to leave those that are explicitly answered last in case we have extra time. And so I'm going to pick the more interesting one where they're not just explicitly answered.
Right.
So this one is from B3, and it's sort of like the one we discussed earlier about the explanatory virtues. So he asks, these aren't like logical principles. So how? But our minds intuitively sort of like presuppose them for rationality. So how? And they cannot be proven or trusted. And then he asks, how do we ground their ontology? But can you make sense of that question?
Yes, I can actually. That's a very good question. Well, there are two ways you could approach this. You could go the kind of the Wittgensteinian way, or the later Wittgenstein, and simply say, look, these are the hinge principles of the practice in which we engage, or the practices in which we engage. If you like, the practices of inquiry in which we engage. These are simply the way in which we operate within these communities of inquiry. I mean, that's true, of course they are, but I don't think simply appealing to practice as a ground is entirely satisfactory, because of course we can also ask, why are these principles of inquiry so successful as they appear to be, certainly in the case of modern science or scientific inquiry? I think the best answer to that is a kind of a pragmatic one, and I think in one of the books I appeal to, William Lycan has a nice discussion of this. I'm a great admirer of William Lycan's work, and he's got a discussion of, it's kind of almost a sort of evolutionary one. These are the sort of principles which you would expect to yield the best results. If you, for example, you choose theories that are simple, then those theories are going to be easier to falsify. It's going to be easier to see what you need to do in order to prove them wrong. Or if you choose principles that have a high degree of empirical content, well, a high degree of empirical content by definition means there are more possible states of affairs that would prove the theory to be wrong. So there are good pragmatic grounds for choosing hypotheses that are of this kind and that they're most likely to lead to the growth of knowledge. So I think if I were to, this is not really a field I feel terribly familiar with, but if I were to try and justify the principles, I would probably adopt a kind of pragmatic justification of that kind.
So just to summarize your answer, you're saying we could take the Wittgensteinian route that he presents on uncertainty and say these are sort of like hinges or preconditions for rationality. They define what it means to be justified. Or we could also say that they're rather grounded pragmatically. These are the theoretical virtues that have led to the success of science. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's right. You've said it much more concisely than I did. Actually, I'm just quoting Bill Lycan here. I've just found the passage in Theism and Explanation. Bill Lycan says, these methods of theory choice are the ones that a wise and benevolent Mother Nature would have given us because they have survival and welfare advantage. So it's that kind of pragmatic argument. Yes, exactly.
Oh, excellent. Real Atheology asks, with the recent passing of Quentin Smith, it seems the best of atheist philosophers such as Sobel, Mackey, Smith, Rove are all dead. How do you think the state of atheism is currently in the analytical philosophy of religion? Do you feel atheists are doing a good job responding to the new development in the case for theism from people like Robert Kuhns, Alexander Prost, John Rasmussen, as well as Thomas like Phaser? Do you foresee a new generation of robust analytic atheist philosophers emerging in the future, just as we have seen with the theistic philosophers?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. It is true that, we still have people like my colleague and friend Graham Oppie, who do a wonderful job as very, very competent atheist philosophers of religion. But it's true, and people like John Schellenberg, I think John would call himself an atheist. I'm not sure. Maybe he wouldn't, but he's certainly not a conventional theist, I think. But that's a good point, actually. It's true that there's been this terrific revival of philosophy, this terrific development of a kind of philosophy of religion engaged in, often by evangelical people coming from an evangelical Christian background. I think the problem is that quite a lot of atheists, I suspect, now just can't be bothered. They feel that, well, I should speak for myself. It's hard to be motivated to continue to debate a position that you yourself feel has been adequately refuted. And why should we continue to devote a lot of energy to it? That being said, of course, a lot of these people like Alexander Pruss, Josh Rasmussen, whom you mentioned, Robert Koons, of course, being really good philosophers, they raise lots of interesting questions, even if you're not interested in religion. So their work is obviously worth reading for those reasons alone. But it's a good question. I don't know is the answer. As always with a philosopher, before he gets to I don't know, he says a lot.
Would it be accurate to say it's sort of like people are saying like dealing with like theism as like dealing with astrology or something? It just seems we can spend our energy doing better things.
I feel more like that when I'm reading someone like Alvin Plantinga. I really, at the end, I just can't be bothered. Because in a way, Plantinga's arguments really are so kind of tightly, well, he claims they're not circular arguments, but they rest on such a strong conviction of the truth of Christianity and simply assume that. Whereas a lot of other really good theist philosophers of religion are not like that. They are producing, fundamental arguments for their view, and those arguments are always worth grappling with. My concern is that there are lots of other interesting philosophical questions about religion which are not being discussed, and we're still dealing with only one religious tradition. So it's still quite a narrow discussion, even when it's a really good one.
Well, I think I'd like input a question for myself there. But like, what do you think about like Reformed epistemology? Do you think it's kind of like vacuous? It's like a conditional. If Christianity is true, then we're justified, which is kind of an interesting claim. Or do you have like a different view of it?
Yeah, look, if I understand Reformed epistemology, if I understand Plantinga's position, it boils down to if Christian faith is true, if Christian belief is true, then it has warrant. But this seems to be.
No, someone.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Just was somebody accidentally unmuted their mic.
Okay. So if Christian belief is true, then it has warrant. But this seems to me to be a kind of vacuous claim or a trivially true claim, because amongst what gives it warrant is the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit and the sensus divinitatis, the sense of divinity. But of course, belief in these is part of what's entailed by Christian faith, or at least the Calvinist version that Plantinga is referring to. So if Christian faith is true, then it has warrant, is equivalent to if it is Saturday and the sun is shining, then the sun is shining. Well, this is a true conditional, but it's not a very interesting one. So when I realized that, I kind of lost interest in Reformed epistemology.
Is the idea supposed to be that within the very concept of Christianity, warrant is included, and so it's
Yes,
just
that's right.
so it's a tautology of some sort. So Reformed
Exactly.
epistemology is just like a tautology. Okay, yeah, that
Yeah,
was an interesting.
that's a kind of tautology. I mean, it's it's like the modal ontological argument. If you include the property of necessary existence in your concept of God, well then, yes, God exists, but we don't seem to have achieved a great deal of insight by doing this.
So yeah, boy Pant is asking about deductive style cosmological arguments. He's saying that such arguments aren't inherently comparative, such as the type of arguments that are given by Swinburne and others, the ones you call abductive, even though Swinburne doesn't think of them that way. But the theist is still, with these deductive style arguments, he is still, in a way, positing God as an explanation for some fundamental facts about reality. What are your thoughts on whether your discussion of theoretical virtues would apply here to deductive arguments?
Actually, you're right. This is a very good point. And I was aware of this when writing Theism and Explanation, that a lot of modern arguments for the existence of God are loosely paralleled, of the kind, say, Richard Swinburne offers, are loosely parallel to scientific arguments, in that they say, here we have some puzzling fact about the universe, let's look for the most likely explanation. And so you're relying upon some kind of abductive reasoning, inference to the best explanation. You're absolutely right, of course, when you say that a strictly deductive argument, such as a deductive cosmological argument or an ontological argument, if you say, for example, all contingent facts have a cause, the existence of the universe is a contingent fact, nothing can be the cause of itself, therefore the universe must have a cause which is distinct from itself. Something like that is not an argument of the best explanation. It's not a comparative argument. And so it is it is different in form. So to the extent that you are pointing out that what I discuss in my book doesn't cover all forms of argument for the existence of God, I agree. I think that's correct.
Right. I believe in one part of your book, you do say that, though it seems like you're not entirely sharing the book, but you say that it seems like Leibniz cosmological argument could be seen as an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing.
I don't know. I'd need to go back and think about that and look at Leibniz's position again. I won't try to comment at the moment.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can move on to Timber, who asked, Oppie has mentioned on several occasions that he thinks theories come before arguments. In particular, he has said that the right way to debate over God is to compare worldviews across all data. So the idea here is supposed to be something like whether an argument is going to be sound or not is sort of going to depend on what theories you already accept in the background. Would you accept with this? Would you agree with Oppie here?
Look, I agree very much with Graham here. Graham's written about this in a little recent book, the title of which I'm trying to remember. But I think he's absolutely right. Actually, just trying to remember what book of Graham's this is. If Graham's online, you could tell us probably. But I agree. Oppie, what Graham argues is that Philosophy of Religion, an opinionated introduction, I think the book is called. Yes, Graham mentions that theists and atheists each produce arguments, but in each case, the premises of the arguments look really convincing to the people proposing them because of the other beliefs they hold. Their worldview more generally, the whole set of interconnected beliefs out of which they're operating. But to those on the other side, the premises of the argument just look, why should I believe that? And so the arguments inevitably fail to convince. And so Graham is suggesting, I think quite rightly, that what we need to do is a much more difficult task, is to take theism, or some version of atheism, as a large-scale explanatory hypothesis, and then say, well, which more satisfactorily accounts for all the data? I think that's not representing Graham's argument. And that, I think, is absolutely right. Just continuing to discuss arguments doesn't seem to be the way of making any progress, if progress is to be made on these questions. So yes, I agree with Graham.
With that in mind, I think Doug's question is going to be a good hair, which is, do you think that arguing about theism is pointless? Do you think arguments about God will ultimately lead nowhere? Do you think arguments for God are rational, or are they simply trying to rationalize fundamental non-rational beliefs and intuitions?
Right. I don't think they're worthless, because, as I said before, if you read really good theistic philosophers, and some of them were named earlier, Josh Rasmussen and others, you always learn something. I mean, you read any really good philosopher, even arguing for a position that you might, or Robert Kuhn's, Alexander Proust, these are all, excellent philosophers. So you can never read them without learning something. So I would never dismiss any argument put forward by a really competent philosopher, however much I may disagree with its conclusion, because I will surely learn a lot from grappling with it. That being said, if you look at what William Lane Craig says in a couple of places, he makes it very clear that he accepts the view put forward by Martin Luther, that reason can have only a ministerial role here, as he puts it. It must serve the act of faith. So the arguments are put forward by someone like Craig in order to support a commitment that he holds on quite different grounds. And also, of course, he's never going to allow the arguments to defeat that commitment, because the arguments are not the basis of the commitment. And if you ask William Lane Craig what the basis of the commitment is, it turns out to be the self-authenticating voice of the Holy Spirit in his heart, something like Calvin's internal testimony of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's fine, but then you realize that the arguments are actually a kind of window dressing, and to focus on the arguments is not really to understand what's motivating people's belief. So, and again, this is where it seems to me a focus on arguments is not really understanding how religion operates, which is what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay, thank you. I guess the next question, the theory of evolution, do you think it has survived the criteria of testability?
Oh, theory of evolution. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I don't claim any particular expertise when it comes to evolutionary theory. I know that Karl Popper famously suggested it was more like an untestable sort of metaphysical hypothesis, but I think since those days, put it this way, there's a kind of consilience here. There are so many facts that have come together that seem to be explained within the framework of evolutionary theory, that although no scientific theory is proven once and for all, this seems to be as well confirmed in its modern form as any. So I think, yes, the answer is probably yes there.
I see.
But as I say, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so I wouldn't pretend any particular expertise.
Right. But yeah, you're correct. Like Popper did regard it as a metaphysical research program, but he did change his mind a couple of years later.
Right. Yeah. I think he was right to. I think he was right to change his mind.
Well, at least Popper got something right.
I'm a bit of a Popperian. I like Popper. Anyway, let's carry on.
In your sorry, I forgot Relay Theology. He says, how do you respond to critiques of your work, and the work he has in mind is Theism and Explanation, that point out that Theism is not a scientific explanation, but rather a metaphysical hypothesis? And while it may not be able to compete with naturalism as a scientific explanation, it is superior to naturalism as a metaphysical one.
Right. I'm just trying to find that question. Right. That's a really good question for a variety of reasons. When I wrote Theism and Explanation, I tended to assume, although I do leave the question open, that any really good explanation of some set of empirical facts would count as scientific. I'm not so confident now that's the case. I think that actually from the very beginning, and I mean from the times of Thales in ancient Greece, or Hippocrates, the founder of modern medicine, scientific explanations have limited themselves to natural causes. Even Aristotle, while he talks about a prime mover in the physics, he only identifies the prime mover with God in the metaphysics. So I might be more inclined now than I was when I wrote Theism and Explanation to say, look, even if we had a really good explanation of some set of phenomena which appeals to God, it wouldn't count as scientific. It would be something more like a metaphysical claim. So yes, I'd make a sharper distinction, I think, now than I did there between science and metaphysics. That being said, of course, there are quite a lot of philosophers doing metaphysics who think that actually, I mean, follow Quine's example, I guess, in that metaphysics, if you're going to do metaphysics, it ought to be as a kind of continuous with science and an extension of it. So you should be reasoning in a similar way to the ways in which scientists reason. So I'm not sure in what way theism will be superior to naturalism as a metaphysical theory, unless you're relying on... Yeah, I'd like to know a bit more about how theism could be thought of as superior to naturalism as metaphysical theory. I'm not sure about... I have difficulties knowing what naturalism means if it's meant to be a metaphysical position. Inevitably, it's very hard to pin down. The only entities that exist are natural entities. Does that mean they're physical entities? Does that mean the entities posited by today's physics, or the kinds of entities posited by today's physics? But there are lots of things we talk about that aren't the kinds of entities posited by today's physics, like hopes and dreams, or rates of inflation, or... So I'm not sure what to make of naturalism as a metaphysical position. If naturalism is an epistemological position, saying how we should go about searching for knowledge, how about attaining knowledge, then you might, if you're a naturalist metaphysician, you'll think that you'll do so in a way that closely resembles the methods of the sciences. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of naturalism as a metaphysical position.
Right.
I wouldn't consider myself a metaphysical naturalist. I might think of myself as a sort of epistemological naturalist.
Right. Well, I just want to add that I'm not sure if it seems like explanations, whether metaphysical or if there's like any meaningful way to distinguish metaphysical from scientific explanations, maybe that's a question to pose to you. Do you think explanations are just of one sort, and they're all like compared according to a set of theoretical virtues? And if so, as an explanation, theism wouldn't fare better? Or do you think there's some meaningful distinction, and there's going to be like separate theoretical virtues for metaphysical and for scientific type explanations?
I mean, the word explanation is terribly broad. I mean, if you want to say you could ask for explanations on logic. Why is it possible? Well, if you think there can be no true contradictions, why is it that there can be no true contradictions in classical logic? And then you might say, well, it's because from a contradiction, anything follows. Ex contradictione quod libet, as the medieval said. Okay, well, that's a kind of explanation, but it's clearly not explaining some phenomena in the world, and it's not appealing to explanatory virtues. So the word explanation can be used in a whole lot of fields in a whole variety of ways. And so, but if you're talking about, certainly theism and explanation, when I wrote it, assumed that if you're talking about causal explanations of phenomena, things we can observe, then I did at the time assume that they would all have pretty much the same form. Yes, I did. I think now I would say that the naturalism of the sciences, their exclusion of divine causes, is not actually modern. It's quite ancient. That even in the medieval universities, you find people doing natural philosophy in a way that makes no reference to God. So I think that idea that science deals only with natural causes, whatever lies behind it, is quite an old one. And yeah, so in that sense, there is a distinction, even if it's just a distinction of who does what. The scientists look for natural causes, the metaphysicians look for some underlying set of principles or something like that.
Right. Yeah, boy asks, in your book you reference the idea. No, sorry, that's already been answered. One of the common responses I hear when discussing theism as an explanation is that theism is so much more than an explanation. It's a community, a way of life, a grounding for purpose, etc. Do you think treating theism only as an explanation is reductive? And what do you think? And what do you think of the prospects for evaluating theism as true via something other than an explanatory framework?
Look, I agree with the first part of that question very much. I think theism is, of course, so much more than an explanation. Well, theism, what do you mean I say theism? I mean, Islam, for example, which is a theistic religion, is so much more than an explanation. It's a religion. And that means it's a community, it's a way of life, it has ritual dimensions. I've been to mosques on a number of occasions when I was teaching an introductory course on Islam, and I find the rituals of the Salah, the rituals of prayer, very attractive just as rituals. I love ritual. And so, yes, I mean, that's simply a way of saying, I think, that one of the things I've been trying to say recently, that when philosophers abstract from a religion a certain set of doctrines and only discuss those, they don't really understand the religion, where the doctrines are embedded in a practice. Religions are practices before they are doctrines. They are things that communities do. One of the early scholars of religions famously remarked that a religion is danced out before it is thought out. It's a lovely quote. That religions are enacted before they're theorized. And that's why I really think philosophers ought to focus on some of the non-intellectual dimensions of religion. A number of people have been saying this recently, but I think it's a very important point. Now, the second part of the question is, would this make us more likely to regard theism as true? I don't know. You can certainly offer pragmatic arguments in favor of a religious commitment, which of course Pascal did, and Richard Swinburne does in Faith and Reason, John Bishop does in Believing by Faith, where you're saying, look, this way of life is really attractive to me. And so, and as a matter of practical reasoning, it might be true. For all I know, it's not obviously false. And so I'm entitled to make a commitment that goes beyond the evidence on kind of pragmatic grounds. That may well be true. I mean, that's not an unreasonable argument. John Bishop's book, Believing by Faith, I think is an excellent argument in favor of that kind of religious commitment. It's not, however, a commitment, an argument for the truth of theism. Right. It's a practical rationality argument for the reasonableness of your making a commitment to this way of life.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of the Jordan Peterson type of a thing.
Yes, I guess it is. Yes. I haven't read a great deal of, or listened or watched a great deal of Jordan Peterson, but some of his early stuff on myth and meaning, I think is interesting that yes, our lives are shaped by stories, as people like the philosopher Paul Ricoeur have pointed out, but lots of people have pointed out. Charles Taylor's written a lot about the role of narrative in human life. And of course, religions provide myths, they provide stories that shape people's lives. And in fact, how mythic explanations work, how people explain things, as it were, in inverted commas, explain or interpret what's happening to them by reference to some foundational myth, that's something philosophers ought to be studying. The anthropologists have studied it quite a lot, but the philosophers have largely ignored it. But actually, this is the way religions operate in practice. People take a founding myth. It might be the story of Jesus. When I say a myth, I don't mean it's not true. Some of these myths are true, but they take a founding myth and they live their lives in a way which tries to reproduce the pattern of the myth. This is an extraordinarily common practice across religions, and yet philosophers have largely ignored it.
Right. Lu Long says, Professor Dawes, in your book, Theism and Explanation, you develop a case against the prospect of theistic explanations. In that book, you developed the view that God acts optimally, and one objection to this thesis you entertain are theistic objections to the effect that there is no best possible world. I had a few questions in relation to the optimality thesis you present in the book. If a theist were to successfully defend the no best world objection without undermining the notion of divine action, do you believe it is possible for the general case you present in Theism and Explanation that it can survive and be sustained, perhaps with modification? And if you think so, how so?
I think I do discuss that in the book. Even if you say there is no best possible world, or we can make no sense of the idea of the best possible world, what I suggest in the book is that all we need to do to defeat the theistic explanation is to conceive of a better way in which God could have brought about this purpose. So it's kind of, even if we have a scale of goodness in worlds which has no upper point, all we need to do to defeat the theistic explanation is to say, look, we can conceive of a better way, a way of God could have achieved this end without, for example, which wouldn't entail so much suffering. I mean, evolution by natural selection, for example, seems to be a terribly wasteful process. Surely God could have brought, if you think God's responsible for the evolutionary process, was a very wasteful way of doing it. Surely he could have done it. He could have created the world in 6 days just by speaking. There's, I think the intuitions behind the writers of Genesis 1 were quite right. So I don't think that argument I give depends on the idea of that there is a best possible world. Now, of course, you could argue that, look, we can never know what it would be possible for God to do, which is what skeptical theists say in response to the argument from evil. Now, that might be right. I have some sympathy for skeptical theism because I agree with Peter van Inwagen that our modal knowledge, our knowledge of possible states of affairs, is probably quite local. We can only be confident about possible states of affairs that are fairly close to the actual world. Now, Van Inwagen's right that we could never know just what God could do, then that would undermine my argument. But of course, it would also undermine any possibility of theistic explanation, because that relies on the principle that if God existed and wanted to do X, then the world as we see it is what we would expect. So skeptical theism is fine if you hold to something like Plantinga's view or William Lane Craig's view that arguments are not the basis of your faith. But if you want to defend theistic explanations, you shouldn't go the skeptical theism route. Now, I'm just having a look at the rest of that question. Do you want to keep following it up?
Sorry, the number 2 and number 3, or?
Yes.
Yeah, so we can read number 2. The optimality thesis in application seems dependent on an understanding as to just what it is that God acts to maximize or act optimally towards. In other words, the target of God's action may change our perspective on just what is being predicted or to be explained. What would your take on views where God's principal aim is taken globally with respect to the world as a whole rather than as a hyper-specific with respect to individual matters of fact?
Yes, that's a good point. That's a good question. I suppose when I was thinking of theistic explanations, I was thinking explanations of, well, not just individual matters of fact, but general states of affairs. Some of them might be very general. Richard Swinburne famously starts with the fact that there are laws of nature, that the natural world acts in regular and predictable ways. But how do you think of that as a hyper-specification or an individual matter of fact? It's a very broad fact about the world. If you say that God's aim is taken globally with respect to the world as a whole, I'm not quite sure what that means unless you break it down to a series of general facts about the world. What do you mean by the world as a whole? And what exactly is God specifying? You can say that, but I'm just not quite sure what the content of it would be. It seems to me you'd really want to turn that into a series of facts about the world, so we've got something we can grapple with. But they don't have to be very narrow individual matters of fact. They can be quite broad facts, such as, to take Swinburne's example, the fact that there are laws of nature. Yeah.
How about I just unmute the person who asked the question and he can clarify what he meant?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
Great. Please do.
Yeah, go ahead, Lou.
Okay, yeah, I asked, there was a little follow-up to that, and I think maybe explain a little better the context I was kind of coming at it from. So people like Plantinga and a few others, like Plantinga has this whole like Felix Culpa, Theodicy, whatever, and there are others like Thomas, like Rob Koons and the like, kind of riffing off this whole the best of all possible worlds kind of approach. They don't view God necessarily as, like, let's say there's an individual instance of somebody suffering, and like sort of the traditional dialectic and the problem of evil is that there's some hyper-specific reason as to why this very individual instance of suffering occurred at the time that it did in the way that it happened, right?
Yep.
The approach that some philosophers take instead is not to suppose that there is, that God specifically willed this event to occur, or that there's some reason as to why this particular evil happened. Rather, they might say something like, look, God wills the world as a whole, and he's willed the world in such a way that it assumes a fallen state, and over time the world is redeemed, and God finds this to be a valuable feature of the world as a whole. that this kind of movement from sort of a state of fallenness to a state of redemption. And you can say whatever you like about that. There's all kinds of things to be said. But I think the general idea is that it's not as though God is willing what makes up this general fabric in this narrative or this story, but rather almost akin to that of top-down causation. He's willing the world as a whole, and these individual matters of fact fit into it. So we might say perhaps the world does, I guess the move I'm suggesting a theist might bring up is that perhaps they might say, if you consider God's aim to be with respect to the world as a whole, then perhaps what we do see does fit into this optimal plan, given what his aim is aimed towards, not towards optimizing anything locally, but optimizing this narrative on a global level.
Right. Okay. Thank you. No, that's a bit clearer. There is a slight problem here. If you're a classical theist of the Christian, Muslim, Jewish variety, then of course you hold that God wills every event that happens. It wouldn't happen unless God willed it. So God's causation and willing of events is ubiquitous. Now, of course, you can modify your conception of God. You can't just have. So yeah, on a classical theist view, you can't sort of isolate God's. Excuse me, just a minute, Chrissy. The phone's ringing. Oh, sorry. You can't isolate. You can't insulate God from particular events, put it that way, because He is responsible for them. Now, of course, you can have a different conception of divinity. Some years ago, I was very fascinated by the process theology put forward by Alfred North Whitehead, Charles Hartshorne, and others, where you've got a rather different conception of divinity, and it's a divinity that kind of entices the world by kind of teleologically by being the goal towards which the world develops. But like Aristotle's God didn't act in the world, but was the final cause of everything that happened, the good towards which everything was attracted. That's a very attractive view of divinity, I think, and may well, but it's not quite classical theism.
Okay, thank you. Theology is a set of interesting questions, which I think you'll answer quickly. So we have like 15 more minutes, unless you want to go overtime, but I guess we'll just discuss it then. But his question is, let's start with the last one. In Graham's Up, a critical note of G.P. Moreland, book on consciousness, he writes, "For what it's worth, my own view, borrowing a turn of words from Moreland, is that even in light of the explosion of Christian philosophy, the probability of theism is so low that it approximates to zero. I expect that other naturalists acquainted with the relevant literature of the last 25 years will say the same. Do you agree with this statement?"
I think I heard Graham say in his AMA the other day that he was never very confident about assigning kind of numerical levels of probability to something like the existence of God. And I'm the same. It's always struck me as slightly odd. But if you were to say in general terms, put it this way. If you were to say that your basis for believing in God is that the God of Christian theism is the best available explanation of the world as we can see it, then the explanation would look so unlikely that it would come pretty low down the scale of probability. Yes, I think that's right. My book was defending the possibility of a theistic explanation. It certainly wasn't saying that any of them on offer are terribly convincing. So a colleague of mine who began by studying philosophy and moved into the historical study of religion, I said to him a few years ago, why are you no longer interested in philosophy of religion? He said, well, it just seems it's also unlikely to be true. Why should I bother? And that probably is the attitude of many atheists, that, okay, well, it could be true, but it just seems so unlikely. Why would you grappling with it? Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Tyrannical asks, are you familiar with Mircea Eliade and his works? I probably butchered that guy's name, and his works on the sacred and profane.
Mircea Eliade, yes, I am. Eliade was a big name in religious studies years ago when I began studying religion. He kind of fell out of favor because he was thought to be a bit too broad, a bit too sweeping in his generalizations, and he had his own kind of theological slant. Eliade was also a supporter of some various unpleasant right-wing causes, but then so was Heidegger, whom I do read. So I am familiar with Eliade, and I think Eliade's in the Profane, which is really borrowed from Durkheim, is a very interesting one. And I do think that to think of religion in terms of what people hold as sacred, the sacred having kind of normative significance, being protected, being set apart, the idea of the sacred and the profane, I think, is still a very useful one in the study of religion. In fact, my philosophy of religion course, which used to be called Philosophy of Religion here at the university, is now called Reason, Belief, and the Sacred, because I think the idea of the sacred is a valuable one. So I'm not altogether convinced of Eliade's work as such, but I think what it was writing about is a really important idea. And lots of cultures have these distinctions, the sacred and the profane, or the equivalent. Here in New Zealand, the Maori culture, our indigenous culture, has the tapu, or taboo, and the noa, the common, the profane. So these are distinctions which hold across a whole lot of cultures. Really interesting, I think. Yes.
Okay. Relay Theology asks, could you share a bit about how your background as a Roman Catholic priest influenced your work as an atheist philosopher?
Yeah. I think what it did was make me appreciate a point that Graham Oppy makes in his recent book too, that if you've got a big, complex, long-standing religious tradition like Roman Catholicism, you're unlikely to come up with a simple argument against its beliefs which hasn't already been thought of by somebody within the tradition. That I came to have a great respect for the tradition of Catholic theology and for the way in which it had already grappled with and tried to provide answers for many of the objections that atheists come up with. I get terribly tired when atheists open a Bible and say, oh, look at all the terrible things God does in the Old Testament, as if this was news. The rabbis had dealt with this within Judaism. People like St. Augustine give you principles of interpretation for how to interpret the Bible in a way that isn't morally abhorrent. So, the tradition of Roman Catholic theology, which I became familiar with, and which was broadly Aristotelian, I have a great respect for. And, someone mentioned in one of the questions the Thomist tradition in modern philosophy of religion, which is emerging at the moment. I think that's really interesting. I'm a bit of an Aristotelian at heart. I have a great admiration for Aristotle's philosophy. We have a cat called Aristotle, who unfortunately is not a very clever cat. But I think probably what's my study is in Roman Catholic theology has given me respect for how complex the intellectual traditions of these religions can be, and therefore how carefully atheists need to study if they're going to argue against them.
All right. The same person also asks, I think a lot of people would want to know this, but he says, your book, Theism and Explanation, is rightly considered by many to be one of the best defenses of naturalism and atheism today. I agree with that statement. Do you think you will write more defenses of atheism and naturalism in the future? And what other projects are you working on now? I guess you could add a bit more, even though you said in your introduction what you're working on now.
I have written a couple of papers on atheism, one defending a kind of methodological atheism. I'm not 100% convinced by what I wrote now, but I have done that. I've also written a paper with Tiddy Smith on the naturalism of the sciences, which is a more historical one, saying that actually, interestingly enough, the sciences appear to have been naturalistic from their very origin. And I think there are historical reasons for this, to do with Aristotelian division of sciences, to do with the structure of the medieval universities and so on. Defending naturalism. I'm very interested now in, there are people in philosophy of science, Nancy Cartwright is one, but there are a whole lot of others. I'm trying to remember their names off the top of my head, trying to defend what they call a pluralist realism, that you can have, that the world is you can have many true descriptions of the world emerging from different cognitive practices, which are not obviously compatible with each other, but which we could regard as true. So there isn't just one true ontology, as it were. There's a possibility of a kind of pluralism in the way in which the world is revealed to us. This is a very difficult idea to defend without slipping into some sort of silly relativism or idealism, but there are people working on it. So kind of pluralist realism is my slogan for what I would like to explore. And we do have true pictures of the world, but we can have many sets of true pictures of the world which aren't obviously compatible with each other. If that's the case, I'm not quite sure what to make of naturalism, unless you take naturalism to be a purely epistemological naturalism, that the sciences are a model of how to attain knowledge. A metaphysical naturalism, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if I'm very keen on trying to defend.
All right. What role do you think intuitions, so Dog, this is Dog asking, what role do you think intuitions and emotions play in informing our metaphysical outlooks, particularly when it comes to religion? Do you think Hume's quote about reason being a slave to the passions is applicable to epistemology?
A very interesting question. I think we're probably, as individuals, predisposed to certain philosophical positions for reasons that are, not strictly rational. But, we're probably born either inclined to believe in universals, to be nominalists, I'm not sure, or there are all sorts of reasons which can predispose us to a I'm, for example, because of my political beliefs, am probably suspicious of philosophical positions that are very individualist, which conceive of human society as made up of entirely self-sufficient individuals who then might then enter into a social contract. This seems to me to be deeply misguided, but also I don't like it because it seems to me to lend support to a kind of free market capitalism, which I don't particularly approve of. So, yeah, that's a kind of political predisposition I have, which predisposes me towards certain philosophical views. But of course, I would still have to defend those views in terms of offering reasons for them. So I suppose you could here distinguish a context of discovery from the context of justification, perhaps, and say, look, all sorts of things might predispose us towards a view. But at the end of the day, if we're engaged in rational discussion, we have to produce reasons for it that other people might find convincing. But I think it's true that these things are never simply a matter of cool, calm reason.
All right. Well, just to add to that a question, do you believe in non-inferential justification, or rather, do you believe that intuitions are epistemic justifiers?
Ooh, now there's a question. Of course, people have become terribly suspicious of intuition in philosophy in recent years, and I think often with good reason. Our intuitions, A, are not always reliable, and B, appear to differ from culture to culture. There have been some very interesting studies of the way in which even quite fundamental things, the famous Müller-Lyer illusion, the two lines with arrowheads pointing in different directions, which to us, one line just immediately looks longer. But actually, in cultures, in very different cultures, people don't seem to experience that illusion. So even our visual perception appears to be shaped by the kind of environment in which we've been brought up. Probably those brought up in a more carpentered environment with lots of sharp edges and straight lines just see the world differently. So even our immediate perceptual intuitions are shaped by culture, it seems, to some degree. That all gives you reason to be suspicious of intuition as a foundation for knowledge. So yeah, I think I probably share the current suspicion about merely relying on intuitions. Of course, you can engage in a reflective equilibrium type exercise where you start with, as we do in moral philosophy, we tend to start with moral intuitions, which is often, hopefully, good ones, but then we discuss them, we compare them with facts, we put them through various arguments, and then our intuitions will change over time. In the light of that, that's fine. No, we can start with intuitions and then discuss them, subject them to critical scrutiny, kind of arrive at a reasoned intuition. That seems to me to be often the only way we can proceed in some fields like moral philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you're saying is there's reasons to be skeptical of intuitions, but you don't think all epistemic justification have to be inferential. Would that be correct?
No, well, that's right. I'm inclined to be, as I mentioned before, I think the work of Robert Brandom, which I'm attempting to read at the moment. And Brandom's very much an inferentialist. He thinks of knowledge or the content of our beliefs in terms of the inferences that can be made to them and from them. But even Brandom, I think, that there are certain, as I understand it, I'm not a Brandom expert, so someone can tell me if I'm wrong, that there are certain perceptual beliefs, for example, which are, in a certain sense, non-inferential beliefs. We just form them spontaneously. No, of course, they're not infallible, but we haven't reasoned our way to them. So, yes, I think there are non-inferential beliefs. They shouldn't be regarded as infallible, and they're probably already shaped by our context and our culture, but they exist, and they're at least a starting point for further reasoning. Yes. Yep.
So some people are... Oh, so did you have something to add?
I was going to say,
go ahead.
I'm not sure if the existence of God is one of those. Question. Okay, carry on.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, I'm just saying people are bugging me to ask you some historical questions.
Okay, sure.
And so, like, one of them is, what do you think about the general historicity of the Bible, disregarding the supernatural claim? Do you think it's a reliable source of information about, say, the life of Jesus?
Yeah, I think you need to make distinctions here because the Bible, of course, is a very big, complex work put together over quite a long period of time with traditions, some of which are very old and some of which are much more recent. So if you talk about the stories about Abraham, for example, I think at this point it's very hard to know whether the stories about Ibrahim, if you prefer, in the Bible, many of which are also found in the Quran, it's very hard to know what foundation, in fact, these have. On the other hand, if you get to the stories about Jesus in the New Testament, I think we do have some reason to think that the basic story here and a number of things that Jesus is supposed to have said, at least in the first three Gospels, we probably have as good a basis for saying something about the historical Jesus as we do about any figure of who lived so long ago. There's a very good scholar called E.P. Sanders, a New Testament scholar, who's has written on the historical Jesus, and his book on the historical Jesus is one I would tend to go back to as, look, he does a pretty good job of filtering the evidence and saying, look, what can we say about Jesus as a figure of history? Actually, quite a lot. And it's, of course, largely based on the Gospels because they're the only source we have.
I assume, and just to ask it, I assume you find something like Christ mythicism to be like a crazy position, right?
So what was that again?
Skepticism about the existence of Jesus, like Christ mythicism.
Well, it just seems to me to be unduly skeptical. I mean, I'm happy to be skeptical, but if you're going to doubt the existence of Jesus, on the same grounds you'd have to doubt much of what we assume to be, the stories about Nero, the Roman emperor. Actually, some of the stories probably are invented by his enemies. He was a nasty enough piece of work without that. But, we would have to doubt so much. If we doubt that Jesus existed, you're being far more skeptical than we normally would be with regard to a figure of history, I think.
I see. Another historical question is, looking at history of science and religion, when do you think science and religion have conflicted the most, and when do you think they've conflicted the least? Or better yet, complemented each other?
Well, I've just written a new book about that. Yes, I've got the book I've got coming out called Deprovincializing Religion, which you'll be relieved to know is very short, just in the Cambridge Elements series. It traces the history of the religion science complex just to some degree. I think it's very difficult to know, but what makes for a conflict between religion and science, as we see in a case like the Galileo affair or today's conflicts about evolutionary theory, is the idea that faith represents a distinct source of knowledge alongside human reason. Once you've got that idea that religion offers you access to reality by a different route from the route by which science has access to reality, then, of course, there's always the danger of the two coming up with different conclusions and coming into conflict. And so this epistemological dualism, as I call it, I think is at the very heart of religion and science conflicts. And for various historical reasons, it's become more pronounced in the Christian West than it has been in many cultures. So I think the development of science, which became increasingly secular, and a religion which became increasingly focused on the authority of the divine revelation, has led to the possibility of religion and science conflicts, which wouldn't occur in a different culture. My contrast culture is that of China, where you don't get these sort of conflicts because you get very different relations between what you might think of as scientific and religious beliefs. So I think they do have a history, and the emergence of a clear epistemological dualism, religious people claiming we can know things on the basis of our faith, which cannot be known on the basis of reason. At this point, you've got a clear potential for conflict.
Do you think, you said, just to add, do you think it's been better in the East? Did you have something specific in mind, like the Muslim Golden Age, or what is it that you had in mind?
I mean, the Muslim world has experienced, if you think sort of the Golden Age of Islamic philosophy, where people like Ibn Sina or Al-Farabi were wonderful philosophers. There were tensions that emerged even then. I mean, Al-Ghazali, the famous Muslim philosopher or theologian, was very keen to set limits to how far philosophy was allowed to go, how far natural philosophy was allowed to go in matters of faith. So I think it wouldn't be true to say that even sort of the golden age of Islamic philosophy in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, it wouldn't be true to say that there were no conflicts. There were tensions, of course, even then. Al-Ghazali writes about the incoherence of the philosophers as an attack on philosophical reason, particularly when it comes to deal with matters of faith. So even in the Muslim world, there were tensions in that respect. You don't get tensions like this in China because China's got different kinds of religion and different kinds of science, but that's a big story in itself.
I see. So we've crossed the 1 hour mark. Do you want to continue, or should we wrap it up with like a...
If there are things people still want to talk about, I'm happy to continue a wee bit longer, perhaps another 15 minutes.
Yeah, so we'll do another 15 minutes, and then we'll take a 5 minutes where you'll talk about the book that's coming out and where people can get it, and also where people can find your work and whatnot. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I guess we'll go with the question that says, who are the best defenders of atheism, best books defending atheism in your view? And who are the best defenders of theism, best books defending theism in your view?
I think Graham was asked the same question and was loath to reply. Look, to be honest, I'm very reluctant to single out names for two reasons. One, it's always hard to pick individuals without being unfair to others. And secondly, I am actually not reading a great deal these days in classic defenses of atheism or theism. I've got bored with it. So I am not really up with some of the best recent literature. So I'm loath to answer. If someone would come to me and say, I want to read a really good, thoughtful, insightful, informed, historically informed defense of atheism, I'd probably say I'd send them off to read Graham Oppy's work, probably. Although, of course, classic works like J.L. Mackey's The Miracle of Theism are still hard to surpass. But there are so many, it's very difficult to know. On the theist side, I would say don't read Plantinga, please. Well, you can read Plantinga, but don't expect to gain a great deal of enlightenment. he's very clever, but Richard Swinburne's work is still worth grappling with. But I'm not actually as familiar as I should be with some more. I'm loath to say too much more in that respect.
Yeah, I agree. Plantinga is trash. So is Craig.
Well, I wouldn't say trash. I mean, they're very clever philosophers. You always learn from reading them. There are no philosophers, however much you might disagree with them, that you'll learn nothing from reading. So reading Plantinga made me much more familiar than I used to be with distinctions between internalist and externalist conceptions of justification and warrant, which has been good. So I've learned lots from reading Plantinga, as I've learned from reading, say, William Lane Craig on Kalam Cosmological Argument. So I would never say I'd never say they were trash. I'd always say, look, you'll learn a lot, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure it's going to help you really make much progress on the God question.
Although there was we spoke earlier about like the analytical continental divide. I guess, have you looked into continental philosophy of religion?
Not actually continental philosophy of religion so much, although I'm a great skeptic about the analytical continental divide. I think it's a bit silly. I think it's sort of a mark of tribal affiliation, as a colleague of mine calls it. Well, a colleague and I teach a course here at the University of Otago in a department that's entirely analytic philosophy. We teach a single course devoted to people like Nietzsche, Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and more recent figures like Derrida and others. So I think actually this divide is a great tragedy because it's hard to read Heidegger, but then it's difficult to read Kant, and it's difficult to read Quine. I mean, it's difficult to read Robert Brandon. But, if you're going to understand a great philosophy, you just have to put in the effort. And right. Once you do put in the effort, you find that actually what we call philosophers like Heidegger are dealing with many of the same questions, or even more recently, Derrida, are dealing with many of the same questions that people like Quine or Davidson are dealing with, but from a different perspective, and one that can be quite enlightening. So I think this divide is something we need to get over myself, although I admit it's very hard work to try and be familiar with both traditions. Continental philosophy of religion, I'm not quite sure what writers you'd have in mind here. I'm not so familiar with writers in that tradition writing about religion.
All right. Since if you have a person that like believes in this analytical continental divide, and they're under the view that sort of like continental philosophy is like gibberish, what would you recommend them to read or to look to have their mind changed?
There are some good introductions, certainly, by just at the top of my head. Actually, there's a book on Derrida and Derrida's kind of broadly in this tradition, but he's one who's often thought writing gibberish. I'm just trying to think of the name. There are a few analytic philosophers who have done a nice job of translation of I'm not sure if I can quickly find a name. But Simon Critchley has written quite nicely on some of these people. But probably the best thing is to try and find, Wheeler is the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, there's a nice book on Derrida by, just trying to think of the name now. Sorry, I'm having problems finding something. But the author's name is Wheeler. I can't think of his first name off the top of my head. And he's written a very nice book. Samuel Wheeler is the author's name. Samuel Wheeler. A very nice book discussing Derrida's work, but which relates it, say, to the Quine. So something like that is extremely useful. Someone who's bothered to try and understand Derrida, who sees that Derrida is dealing with issues similar to those being dealt with by big names in analytic philosophy, and who can help you to see the connections. So, yeah, that's probably the way to go.
His daughter is actually a member of this community.
Oh, really?
Samuel Wheeler, yeah.
Samuel Wheeler's daughter?
Yeah, she's around here all the time.
Oh, how wonderful. That's great. Well, you can tell her that I liked her father's book very much.
Let's see.
I will tell her that.
Jack, did you want to ask him about the in-principle objection, or should I?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so, Boy asks, there have been a number of problems with Bayesian epistemology, especially in application to abductive reasoning, the problem of the priors. Do you think the explanationist view you adopt with its general abductive schema is able to avoid some of these problems, or is Bayes, and thus the issue therein, a necessary framework to ground abductive reasoning?
Oh, that's a good question. I was trying to ground abductive reasoning without Bayesian epistemology, as you will have seen. Partly because I haven't done a lot of work in Bayesian epistemology, and the people I work with haven't been terribly into it either. So I just thought if I could avoid it, I would save myself a lot of complications. I know that some people think abductive reasoning requires Bayesian reasoning. On the sort of topics we're dealing with, I'm not sure how far Bayesian reasoning can get you. I mean, Swinburne famously uses it a lot. But you seem to be pulling figures out of the air, largely. Now, for prior probabilities, it's supposed not to matter, because as you go through repeated updating of your beliefs, the prior probabilities, the arbitrariness sort of washes out, as it were. But I'm still not sure if, when it comes to questions like the existence of God, Bayesian reasoning has got the right sort of data. Well, we have the right sort of data to be able to apply Bayesian reasoning. I can see it much more applied to situations where you have statistics, tests that can be put in numerical form, expressed numerically, just seem the more natural home for Bayesian reasoning. But look, I've got no firm opinion on this, because I really don't feel I'm familiar enough with the relationship between abductive reasoning and Bayesian reasoning.
I see. Well, those were really all the questions that were interesting. So I guess we can end it with you talking a little about what you're writing now, and also where people can find your work.
Yeah, well, I'm actually trying to write a piece on animism at the moment, which I'm having great difficulty with. But animism, being a former PhD student of mine, Teddy Smith, wrote a very nice paper in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy a couple of years ago, pointing out that probably the most common form of religion in the history of humanity has been what anthropologists used to call, and are returning to calling, animism. The belief that, trees, rocks, features of the landscape are animate, have an inner life, can be spoken to, can relate to us as we would relate to people. Now, And yet philosophers of religion have paid this absolutely no attention whatever, which is a disgrace. Shows their basically Christian theistic bias. If it doesn't look like Christianity, it's not really religion. Well, I'm sorry. Here's a very common form of religious practice that doesn't look like Christianity. You shouldn't ignore it if you're a philosopher of religion. So I agree with Tiddy. So Tiddy's editing at the moment a collection of essays on animism by philosophers, which I'm happy to contribute to, although it's a difficult topic to write about. Anyway, but the other little book I've just got in print is this. Cambridge University Press have this little series, Cambridge Elements, which are very short introductions to a topic, no more than 30,000 words. So it's only in print, it's only about 60 pages, and my one's called Deprovincializing Science and Religion. And it should be available fairly quickly on the Cambridge University website fairly soon, I'm hoping, and as a PDF file or as a printed book. And it tries to broaden the scope of the religion and science discussion. And so to look at, for example, ancient China, how did what we might think of as science or its equivalent in ancient China and the various forms of religion in China, how did these interact? What about small-scale societies which have no literacy? How does their knowledge, how do they divide up their knowledge of the natural world? How do their religious practices, like animism, relate to science? And Aristotelian natural philosophy, how does that think about the relationship of the God, of divinity and the natural world? So I try and broaden the scope of the discussion in that book, deprovincialize it, as I say. Now, it's a very broad overview, but I hope it might be stimulating, at least might provoke others to look at the religion science discussion more broadly. Would be good. So we also have, Otago University has a research archive, OUR archive, on which I've got a pre-publication copy of my Galileo book. I could, if there's any place to put links on this site, I could send links at some point.
Yeah. So, well, after the AMA, I'll call you to give you the link to the YouTube channel, and then you can give me the link, and I'll pin it in your AMA so people can see it at the top of the text channel. Yeah,
right. So that's right. So so there'll be places there to find work without having to pay extraordinary sums of money. I of course urge everybody to buy the book, but some of these academic books are ludicrously priced, of course, they're very expensive. So there are pre-publication copies available legally. So, yeah.
Cool. And then, is there do you have any website or anything that people can visit?
No, I'm terrible in terms of blogging and social media and that sort of thing. I just, I did have a blog site, but it's so out of date, I fear I shouldn't recommend anyone to go to it. No, probably not.
I did post your Phil papers, which has a link to all your papers. So I assume that's the best thing.
Yes, that's probably as good a place to go as any. Although it may not be. Oh, it's reasonably up to date, I think. Yeah. But of course, good old Google Scholar will turn up most things pretty quickly.
Right. Well, we all want to thank you for the AMA, and I'll make sure to give you the YouTube channel and get the link from you.
Okay. And thank you very much. These were all really good questions. I'm very impressed by the quality of the questions. And also I do want to say that even though there are philosophers with whom I strongly disagree, like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, they are extraordinarily good philosophers in the terms of their their grasp of the arguments, their understanding of the issues. And even though I might say, look, at the end of the day, I've stopped bothering to read them, that's not to say you won't learn an enormous amount from reading them. You know, this is a field in which, even if you think at the end of the day, this argument is badly misguided, you'll learn a great deal from having to grapple. So I think there is no good philosophy you won't gain from reading. I just did want to add that.